Abdel Kader, Vince Jositis, Head of Global Government Affairs for ARM Inc., Arizo Kohistani, the lead of the Private Sector Humanitarian Alliance, and moderator Dr. Maisha Alam, Senior Vice President of Research at Foreign Policy, for a conversation on how to leverage technology and innovations to respond to global crises.
Hi, everybody, and good morning, and thank you again so much for being here. It's my pleasure to have an opportunity to moderate this discussion with such an illustrative panel and to really dive into how do we make innovation work. It's also great to see so many friendly faces in the audience and old colleagues and friends and new ones as well. So I'd love to dive right in, and I'm going to start with you, Mohammed. And as an aside, Mohammed and I worked very closely together a lifetime ago, and he's such a dynamic leader, and I'm just so glad that he is in his role and here with us today. But Mohammed, you're Chief Innovation Officer at USAID. That's a really big job. And so what I wanted to ask you is, how is USAID leveraging innovation and innovative partnership solutions to address increasing complexity when it comes to humanitarian and development challenges? Yeah. One of the things we were talking about is that there's so much going on in so many different places. Can you share some examples of how you're driving impact through innovation?
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Maisha. It's so good to see you again after all these years. We're gonna spend some time catching up. But I'd say maybe just a few kind of framing thoughts. First is that for a lot of our innovation programs, we take on an open innovation mindset. What does that mean? It means that a good idea can come from anyone, anywhere, at any time. And with all due respect to our friends here in DC, sometimes the best ideas aren't just coming from folks here in DC. Maybe they're coming from a research lab in a partner country that we've invested in. Maybe they're coming from an entrepreneur or an innovator that is in a very remote part of the world and not even in sort of the capital city where we may have a mission. With our technology work, which I'll talk about in a moment, we have a framework for that as well, and that the technology that we deploy at sort of an ecosystem level needs to be safe, secure, inclusive, and rights respecting. And sort of the notion behind that is that technology will continue to evolve, right? A couple of years ago, you all may recall we were talking about Bitcoin. Now the conversation is all around artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. So technology will continue to evolve, but our values have to stay steadfast. So again, what we're emphasizing, safe, secure, inclusive, and rights respecting. You'll see that reflected in our digital policy that was actually just announced and released a few weeks back. I'll give you a few examples of what leveraging technology looks like out in the field. It's both the high tech and the low tech, leveraging innovation. It's the high tech and the low tech. High tech meaning things like using artificial intelligence to detect tuberculosis in places like India and Nigeria. In Nigeria alone, we were able to increase detection rates by about 40%. And what folks are essentially doing is coughing into their phone and using bioacoustics. It's saying, not saying you've got it, but it's saying, hey, you may want to go see a doctor. All right. We're seeing similar technology being deployed in the Amazon basin, right? So listening devices literally put up on trees to detect biodiversity, to make sure that we have the right, that there are the right amounts of mammals and birds around, but it's also listening for chainsaws in areas where a park ranger simply cannot cover a landmass. But innovation at USAID also looks like our Development Innovation Ventures program, DIV, investing in an organization or company like Vision Spring, which some of you may know that limitations in vision have a massive impact on the global economy. So our work with Vision Spring basically invested in their process to reduce the cost of eyeglasses from $18 a unit to $6 a unit. That may not sound like a lot, but in reality what that's resulted in is 7 million more people in the world having access to vision. That's 7 million more people who can learn, who can see their loved ones, who can go to work. Big impact. So I can go on and on. It's also mobilizing our research universities, right? We've had research universities who are developing drought-resistant seeds, other research universities in Uganda and in Kansas working together to think about how do we use artificial intelligence to help smallholder farmers detect crop blight, right? So that's innovation in action on our end. So maybe I'll pause there. I can go on and on for a while, I know. I get excited about this stuff.
I love those examples, and one of the things that really stands out to me is the diversity of them in terms of the type of work you're doing, where you're doing it, and who you're partnering with. And I think that's one of the things that really demonstrates just what a rich, a plethora of opportunities there are if you have the willingness and the partners to actually seize them.
Yeah, if I might just add one more thing briefly, Maisha, I know you want to move on, but your opening question was a little the complexity of the world. The world is literally on fire. Like last summer here in DC, we couldn't see the Washington Monument. We couldn't breathe, right? We could barely breathe. And the complexity of these challenges around the world is only increasing. The frequency of them is increasing. So we've got to think about nonlinear methods to tackle these things. And we can't go at them alone. You heard my colleague earlier talk about that. We cannot go at this alone.
And that's why I'd love to bring Arzo into the conversation. And Arzo, you lead the Private Sector Humanitarian Alliance, which is absolutely pivotal when it comes to mobilizing resources and expertise during crises. And as Mohammed was saying, the world is literally on fire. And so let me ask you this. How do you ensure that innovation is not just responsive or reactive, but also really anticipating future humanitarian needs? How do we do both, and how do we anticipate?
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Maisha. Just to kind of take a step back, the reason the Private Sector Humanitarian Alliance was formed was because oftentimes when there is this humanitarian crisis, the private sector is seen as this ATM machine. Here's a pledge, donate here. And when we were trying to understand how do you best engage them in crises, they said we have so much more to offer than just cash contributions. Mm-hmm. And I think part of it is really sitting down with them and trying to understand what are these contributions that they do have. One example that I'll give is last year we held an event at MasterCard at their innovation lab, and we did a sprint and we brought together the likes of IFRC, other NGOs, the UN, all of these other private sector companies, and it was remarkable the breadth and the depth and experience that they did have in terms of responding to crises, but it was always done very ad hocly, very reactively. And what they were missing is to have some kind of a playbook, a central hub that they can go to, but also that the humanitarian sector looks to them and understands what their capabilities are. So who are they as a company? What are the resources that they can lend to contribute to these crises? And then based on that, once we had an understanding of the humanitarian architecture where these companies are, we were then able to develop this coordination framework, a technology platform that then really enables that cross-sector collaboration. And so much of that just came from the resources that these companies themselves did have. And in terms of anticipating it, it's really doing the work ahead of a crisis. Mm-hmm. It can't be that when a crisis happens, you call MasterCard, you call Google, and you say, this is what I need. But it's really taking the time to build long-term strategic partnerships with them and understand what resources they have, and also when you bring them into a room, when MasterCard is sitting there, Airbnb, or even the likes of KKR, it enables this cross-sector collaboration. And so I think part of it is really understanding who they are, what their capabilities are. And oftentimes it's easy to look at a company and say, oh, this is their vision statement, this is what they do. They may not be the best fit for this. And one example of that I'll give is that came out of this MasterCard lab was we had one of the largest NGOs there that were responding to the crisis in Ukraine, and they talked about how when the refugee crisis especially happened in Ukraine, there was millions of people moving, and they just couldn't sit there with pen and paper to register them and give them cash vouchers. And so they said, we made a very significant investment in technology to build this out. And one of the technology companies, a few of them turned around and said, why didn't you just ask us for this technology? Mm-hmm. We could have deployed it very easily, but there isn't that pre-work of understanding who they are and how you can contribute.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And when we think about the realities on the ground and what does it take to actually implement some of these great ideas and then bring them to scale, it's actually a perfect segue, Vince, to bring you into the conversation. And you are at ARM, which has been a critical partner of the State Department's Coalition for Climate Entrepreneurship Hub program. And this is a program that aims to provide innovation hubs for global climate-focused entrepreneurs. And we were talking a little bit backstage, and there are quite a few of these all over the world, and you're present in all of them. And so from that experience, tell us a little bit about what role public-private partnerships can play in terms of the makerspace model, and how is ARM, leveraging its partnerships to drive social impact through entrepreneurship?
Yeah, thanks, Maisha. It's a great question, and real honor to be here with this great panel. But I'll start just with a little bit of background. If you don't know what ARM is, we design CPUs, so it's kind of the brains of computing devices. Just to give you an example of the scale, last year we produced, or our customers produced about 29 billion chips, so it's about 900 per second rolling off of a production line somewhere. And they go into all forms of compute, from kind of the lowest end IoT device that needs a tiny little battery to operate all the way up to the cloud. So we provide this kind of underlying technology that allows innovation to happen on top of it across the range of computing applications. One of the things that was really interesting to us about the CCE was that the mission of it was to get that technology in the hands of people who could use it to solve real-world problems. And they work with local partners. There's CCE hubs in Ghana, Kenya, Vietnam, 3 in Latin America, Jamaica. There's 1 in the Bay Area. And they bring in entrepreneurs and they give them the underlying technology and the support they need to come up with a solution that's going to solve a problem that is not thought of in the commercial marketplace. Example of this, well, you mentioned the deforestation. You took one of my examples. It's another great example of how this technology is being used. But we worked with a company called Cushy Baby in India, and they take tiny little RFID chips, need virtually no power to run. They put them in a pendant, and in places where medical records are not easily accessible, that little pendant stores medical history on a child or on a family. That's one example. There's another example called Rainforest Connection. They take used cell phones, they write an AI application, they attach a small solar panel to it, and they put them up in trees, and the AI can tell, is there illegal deforestation going on here? Is there poaching? It's connected to the cell network. It alerts rangers, because as you said, there aren't enough rangers in these places to cover. Just some really, really dynamic things that are happening. And I can say from talking with a lot of our engineers, it's those sorts of applications which really motivate them. We know our chips are going to end up in phones and the data center, but it's finding new use cases that really solve problems that motivates them to continue pushing the boundaries of what computing can do.
That's amazing, and those examples are really, really fantastic. As I'm listening to you all speak, one of the things that I am reminded of, and that's been a recurring theme over the course of today's event, is how to make innovation happen and how to catalyze change in places where infrastructure is quite limited. And so, Mohammed, I'd love to come back to you and ask you, what are some of the challenges you face when integrating innovative technological solutions in fragile or rapidly evolving contexts, whether that's contexts where infrastructure is very limited, or maybe there's been, with climate change, an extreme weather event and the infrastructure that's limited has been destroyed. How do you overcome those hurdles, and how do you go around it?
It's a great question. I think oftentimes when we're sitting in an audience of folks who are sort of tech files and are interested in what innovation can do, our first interest is, well, what kind of app can we design? Actually, it's one of the things I love about USAID is we're sending folks in to make sure that folks have food and water and basic needs, right? Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think, kind of carries through this. So once that is sort of established, then you are looking at the local context, right? You are thinking about, what do folks need? What does bandwidth look like? Is your technology adaptable? Is it scalable? All the different things that are going to enable you to succeed or not. I think there's another human element there that oftentimes we forget, and perhaps to Arzu's point is thinking about building that resilience. So I'll give you a couple of examples. We work oftentimes with companies like Microsoft and Google to make sure that folks have access. Microsoft has their Airbend initiative, which has been very successful. It's wired schools and communities. Google has done the same, laying fiber optic cable. There's another side of that to build that resilience. It's also like digital literacy programs, and we've got a number of those. that we've supported throughout the years. And part of that is to make sure that folks are more resilient to sometimes the chaos that happens in the wake of an earthquake or a hurricane or a typhoon or whatever the case may be, that you do see a lot of disinformation. So some of that happens in the digital space. We're rolling out a number of technologies, a number of sort of programs in that area as well. So I think we take a very holistic perspective, I would say, at USAID. Maybe I'll pause there, just in the interest of time.
No, thank you. And I'm going to come back to you in a little bit. But as I'm listening to you speak, another thing comes to mind, and that's related to sustainability, right? And again, this has come up, and it's a really important point, which is how do we make sure we're not only not reinventing the wheel, Arzo, but also that the interventions that are introduced, that those innovations are sustainable and that they can outlast the presence of any, organization coming in from outside. And so, Vince, I'd love to talk to you about this a little bit. In terms of performance per watt, my understanding is that this is a key metric when it comes to ARM's work, and especially in driving sustainability. How much energy does computation take up? Let's be real in terms of what does that take, and how are you working towards energy efficiency in hard tech in order to make sure that not only the solutions that you're providing meet the needs of the people that you're supporting, but that they are climate friendly and sustainable?
Yeah. Energy required for computation. You're asking me to get into physics and thermodynamics here, and I was a political science major, but I have done a little bit of research on this, and I know there was a theory that was come up with by an IBM researcher back in the 60s, and a computation can actually be done at an incredibly low amount of energy. Unfortunately, it takes a whole bunch of things to come together to actually reach that, and chips today are actually using millions of times more energy than what's theoretically possible. ARM as a company, we grew with the cell phone market. That was our primary market to begin with, so energy efficiency was kind of necessary because those are battery powered and you don't want your phone to die in an hour or two. So we spent a lot of time on developing technology that's energy efficient. But one really good partnership that we're a part of is coming out of the Department of Energy. It was announced about 2 years ago. It's EES2, and I had to write this down because it's a rather lengthy acronym. It's the Semiconductor Industry Energy Efficiency Scaling Program. But in short, it's essentially bringing together the global leaders in compute. So, the NVIDIAs, the Intels, the Marvells, AMDs, you name it. There's somewhere in the neighborhood of I think 60 corporate partners and about as many university and academic institutions working together. And the goal of that is to actually increase the efficiency of computing 1,000 times over the next 20 years. So it's a lot of technical, pre-competitive work that's being done there. But it's another example of how the public and private sector can work together to really solve what's going to be a major issue for us going forward as AI and other compute resources require more and more energy.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, and definitely something that I think it'd be great to continue looking into. Arzo, to come back to you for a second, where you sit and the work that you do through the Alliance is so important, because ultimately what you're trying to do is bring together stakeholders who might not always be talking to each other, speaking the same language, or even exchanging information. And so in reality, how do you go about fostering collaboration between the private sector and humanitarian or development organizations? What are some best practices, or what are some things that you've seen work well that you want everyone to keep in mind in terms of fostering that collaboration?
Yeah, it just takes time. And I think in any relationship, it takes time to build it takes time to build trust, and also to show, many of these private sector companies, they don't have a dedicated section or department for humanitarian crises, right? So they may have a CSR department, they may have an ESG department, but it's very, a lot of it is very standardized programming that focuses on community. So to tell KKR, hey, can you come and help with the crises in Sudan or Ukraine and things, there's a level of education and familiarizing them with the humanitarian architecture, because none of these companies, except for a few that are very involved, and a lot of them are in healthcare, but really don't have that understanding of what the humanitarian architecture is. So I probably spent a year just having workshops, convening, explaining to them, and also educating myself in terms of what is this architecture? Where does the UN fit in? Where does the US government fit in? And then at the same time, giving them comfort that this is not something that we're starting from scratch. And one of the things that we did early on was develop partnerships with our colleagues at USAID, at the State Department, within the UN, to say, no one is going to replace you, but how do you make the private sector additive to this? And then I think the other part of it is really understanding who these companies are. And I'll go back to the example that we gave of KKR. It's a private equity firm. You wouldn't expect them responding to humanitarian crises. But they said, we have a lot of portfolio companies that are kind of industrial companies. And if there are kind of crises, if we had a playbook well in advance, we could tap into those resources. We could deploy resources to crises, but we just don't know how. And we really don't have the time. And so for us, part of the work was to remove that friction from the system, to let them know that we are creating a space, a hub for them that really informs them of how the sector works, how best they engage. And so if a company like Medtronic or Merck says, I'm willing to give medication, or I'm willing to give XYZ goods, here is all of the processes that you need to follow. We often say that you can't really predict crises, but the consequences of it, we know pretty much. When a refugee crisis happens, when a drought happens, when natural disasters happen. So I think also leveraging technology and letting them see that we are very serious about it, and we are taking the latest development and learning how to be agile, but also scale as well. And I think ultimately it's about building trust, because I think, we kind of alluded to this, they speak different languages, and sometimes the public sector is a bit cautious about what are the motives of the private sector as well. And there are companies, at least from my experience, that genuinely want to intervene and be helpful and kind of almost have this firewall between the business side and the work that they're doing in the humanitarian. And some of them say we don't want any kind of press or publicity around it. But at the same time, they want to know that the work is being guided by humanitarian principles, who are the end beneficiaries. So familiarizing them as well with who the implementing partners and things are. So I think it just takes time to build that trust.
That's great. I love that. I think that's so important. Building trust being kind of the foundation for fostering collaboration. We're almost out of time, but there is a really important question I wanted to ask all of you, and I'm going to ask you to be very succinct, which is, okay, everything we've talked about is great, but how do you actually measure success, right? What indicators or metrics do you use when you're trying to measure the impact that you've had in terms of innovation-driven solutions? So Mohammed, I'll turn to you, and then we'll just go down the line and maybe just one or two things that you identify.
Yeah, you're probably not going to like my answer because it varies. The reality is it varies, and it depends on the tool you're using. So for us, we have challenges, we have prizes, we have an open innovation fund, we have our cybersecurity work. And each, you have to devise your metrics related to the tool that you're using, right? So
Sure.
for instance, our water and energy for food challenge, we think about gallons of water saved, how much food, additional crops a farmer is yielding, how much energy is saved, CO2 reduced. There are a number of things. Our Mombasa Plastics Prize, how much plastic has been put out of the ocean, but how many businesses have started? So again, the metrics will vary. And I think in terms of, as we think about scaling, one, we're certainly looking for the evidence to show that, hey, this is working and this is achieving the outcomes that we intended, and that the local context and leadership and financial support is there and able to help us scale. So
Okay.
I'll pause there.
Great, fantastic. All right, Vince and Arzu, very quickly.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a tough one. I would reiterate what Mohammed said. It really depends on kind of what specifically we're looking at. But across the company, we want to be working with entrepreneurs and startups that are bringing new products to market, and it's kind of what new innovations are coming, what new problems are being solved. how are we supporting companies that are going to be doing something that no one else has done before with our compute solutions? And I would say from a 30,000 foot perspective, that's what we look for.
Yeah, I think for us it's 3 different levels of metrics. One is on the partnerships of understanding who the companies are, what resources they're actually bringing, and how much resources we're able to deploy, not just financial, but also in-kind goods. The other one is at the community level and understanding who the beneficiaries are and not just the speed, but the efficiency and effectiveness of that particular aid reaching them. I'm looking at the time. But then also the humanitarian stakeholders, how efficiently that they're actually collaborating, and is this platform that we're creating and streamlining more efficiencies.
That's fantastic. And as I'm listening to you all speak, two things come up. One is making sure you're context specific or program or whatever, but also at multiple levels. And one of the things that at FP we're really excited about in terms of this partnership on Catalyst for Change is that we will have an opportunity to actually partner going forward to measure impact and better understand how some of these partnerships have been working through our independent research division, FP Analytics. But you'll hear more about that later. In the meantime, thank you so much, Mohammed, Vince, and Arzo. It's been a real pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So good to see you again.